Welcome to Sports Cards once again. Now, there are many ways in which people interact with the sports card hobby. Some take the investor approach to long-term wealth building. Some take the speculator approach to try to strike sudden wealth. Some take the collector's approach to build up a personal collection for the enjoyment of it. And some take the quick flip approach to try to make a quick couple of dollars here and there. In this video, we're going to go into why I think the hobby needs people approaching it from all of these angles and why there is value in all of them. Now, I've heard lots of people complaining about the way in which some people approach the sports card hobby. Some investors think the emotional attachment collectors have to their collection only prevents their own wealth accumulation. Some collectors think that investors and flippers are ruining the hobby by making it all about money, causing it to be a rich man's venture rather than a fan's fun hobby. So many seem to have so much to complain about when people approach this hobby in a way different than the way they do. But I'm here to suggest that not only is the sports card market wide open enough to support all of these approaches, they're actually all necessary in order for the sports card market to thrive, no matter what your specific connection into the hobby is. Now let's look at each of these 4 common ways of connecting into the sports card hobby and consider why they are all essential for a healthy sports card universe. First, let's look at the collectors, perhaps the heart of the sports card hobby. Without collectors, investors would only be seeking the GOATs, and speculators would only be seeking the most likely up-and-coming stars, and every other card would basically be fodder for the fire. Who would care about some cool-looking card from some second-tier all-star if not for the collector? What would even be the purpose of cards, to even include non-GOAT or non-top rookie players if there wasn't someone out there trying to complete this or that set, or trying to find this or that rare card of this or that less popular player who happens to be their favorite or who plays for their hometown franchise, or who's from an era where they have deep memories and nostalgia? Without collectors, no one would want to hold on to cards for the sake of having the cards. So eventually the market would only consist of GOAT cards and the hobby would just be plain boring. The collector is the pumping heart of the hobby. But without the flipper, the collector may not be able to get their hands on the cards they want. The flipper is the second archetype of sports card hobbyists we'll look at. If everyone out there was only a collector and there were no flippers, cards would sit in people's collections and nearly never enter the market. A collector would have the hardest time completing their sets, as they'd have to rely almost entirely on pulling from packs, which is an expensive and inefficient way to do anything. The flipper is also essential for the collector, investor, and speculator to be able to see trends over time and value changes. Without flippers, card values would not change much, because you wouldn't have nearly as active of an ongoing market. With this kind of stillness, eventually you'd likely have a lot of people losing interest in the hobby. If collectors are the heart of the sports card hobby, flippers are the blood running through the whole system, making it active and vibrant. They're the source of the small, ongoing changes that make the whole thing a lot of fun for so many. But without the speculator, the third archetype we'll consider, who's going to be buying the cards that the flipper is flipping that the collector isn't so interested in, or that the investor doesn't yet see as a sure thing. The speculator is the one who makes things interesting and actually connects things to the more day-to-day happenings in the league. Is the one who analyzes what is happening in the sport and uses their knowledge to try to take best guesses on what's on the horizon. Without the speculator, sports card collecting would not need to have much connection to the actual sport at all. An investor may know that an MJ or a Tom Brady card is a good one to consider, but you don't need any sports knowledge at all to know that. The speculator is the one who is a sports fan, who loves analyzing up-and-coming players and following their progress or lack thereof. Without the speculator, it's possible that sports cards could have very little to do with what is actually going on in the sports league itself today. But the speculator can't really exist to make a profit unless the investor is also there. The investor is the fourth archetype we'll look at. The investor uses their knowledge of the sport and of how markets function to try to make good long-term decisions that will pay out dividends over the long term. They may not be as interested in the short-term, more risky card with a high ceiling but a low floor like the flipper and the speculator may be, but they are instead focused on what has a high floor and has a good chance to only continue to go up in value over time. The investor is the one who approaches the hobby with more patience and is not in it for any of the short-term thrills and fun of it, but is in it for the financial side of things. If only investors existed in the hobby, it would be an incredibly dry hobby for sure. But without the investors, the market as a whole would get stuck and it would negatively affect the hobby as a whole. I would suggest that none of these 4 approaches to participating in the hobby is innately better than the others, but I would suggest that none of them could exist without the others. Now, of course, most of us aren't in any just one of these archetypes, but are rather a combination of maybe even all of them. Personally, I think that's the best place to be. By combining the fun of the collector's approach with the exciting game of the flipper's approach, with the sports knowledge development of the speculator's approach, and the economic perspective of the investor's approach, I feel I'm able to participate in the hobby in a way that feels full. For me personally, if I was to lose the perspective of any of these approaches, I honestly think I would lose interest in the hobby and just fade away from it. I find it unfortunately common in the hobby that so many seem to have such a judgmental approach to how others approach the hobby when they approach it differently than they do. I think this is useful perspective for all of us to think about and to realize that the hobby is wide open enough for all sorts. We don't all need to approach it in the same way, and in fact, without diversity, the hobby would become stale and just fade away, which is what none of us would want, except for you, Carl.